Hi. Welcome to the Paul Mellon Center. My name is Shreya Chatterjee and I'm head of research here. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Gary A. Boyd. I'm going to introduce the speaker, tell you a little bit about the talk, and then we'll have the talk. There'll be plenty of room for questions. Feel free, both in person and online. So feel free to think up questions and raise your hand or type it into the chat. So Gary A. Boyd is Professor of Architecture at University College Dublin. Widely published, he has received a series of prestigious awards, including a European Research Council ERC Advanced Grant in 2024 and a Lever Hume Major Research Fellowship 2018 to 22. The latter resulted in the publication of the monograph Architecture and the Face of Coal, Mining and Modern Britain in 2023, and we'll be hearing a little bit from the book. And this won the Alice Davis Hitchcock Medallion for Outstanding Contribution to Architectural History. He has also co-curated a series of international architectural exhibitions, including the Irish Pavilion for the 14th Venice Architecture Biennale. So today we'll be hearing about how the architectures of coal can be understood as a series of ecologies, forms, systems, and connections that existed both within and across the buildings and landscapes that coal mining created. So without further ado, over to Gary.
Thank you very much for having me, to the organisers. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I'm going to talk about three projects I'm involved in at the moment, some of which have already been mentioned. Some are slightly from the past, some I'm involved in at the moment, and some are from the future. And each one in their different ways begin to evoke what I've kind of thought about as this idea of the coalscape, usually without a hyphen. But I think there's a bit of auto-correcting going on. There might be other auto-correcting activities we'll see in a few minutes. But anyway, well, just to say that this, for me, has a very personal aspect. It kind of, the journey by which I began to think about this begins here. In my hometown, when I used to go on walks with my father and my uncle, and there was this mysterious set of steps that I'd always used to run up and down. This is a recent photograph of them, and I talked to my father, didn't know what it was, but my uncle said it used to be a coal mine. And this was literally within about half a mile from my house. And as a boy, I didn't really think anything about it. But then afterwards, I thought, oh my God, you know, there's a coal mine like half a mile from my house that I had no idea about. And these were the steps that my uncle explained went to the pithead baths. Now, pithead baths is another thing which would lodge into my mind, and I'll come back to talk about them in a second. So this is the personal thing. So I come from a coalfield. I come from the coalfield kind of at the top of this map here. This map is from the 1920s, I think. So, for example, Kent is not yet represented as a coalfield area, but we can see that you have North and South Wales, you have Yorkshire, Lancaster, you have the Great Northumbrian coalfields round about Newcastle, and then across central Scotland, where I'm from, leading from Ayrshire over to Fife, the kind of Scottish coalfields. And these kind of begin to ask questions. Okay, obviously coal is quite ubiquitous. You can't go very far without stumbling over a coalfield in Britain. But if we think about coal, we probably think about this. We probably think about this idea of it being antiquated, of obviously it being dirty, and I'm not making any claims for coal being in any way environmentally good for us or anything like this. So we have this kind of idea, these tropes, these stereotypes within our mind of this kind of landscape, and indeed it's a landscape which was there for many years, a landscape inherited from, I suppose, Victorian methods and means of extracting coal. Landscapes like this is an image by Bill Brandt of miners' housing, and you can see this is somewhere in northern England, and you can see how grim this is. You know, there doesn't seem to be any windows. So this kind of dark world, and we're all familiar with this idea of slums and this idea of an incredible kind of problematic, poverty-stricken workforce who are apt to. The other thing, and I never mention this at all in the book, but I'm going to mention it tonight. The other thing we probably are familiar with is this notion of the miners' strike and the idea of conflict within the industry. And obviously, this is the 40th anniversary of this kind of stuff. Not that the miners' strike was a one-off. There was many, many miners' strikes. So the idea of labour and controversy within the realm of accidents and poverty remains quite consistent through our perception and, I guess, the reality as well as the myth of mining. So we begin to then, if you think about COP Paris in 2015, the idea that it was supposed to herald, it hasn't quite happened yet, but it is happening, and I'll show how it's happening in a second. But the idea of the end of coal, especially in Europe, the end of mining, the end of the idea of producing coal for electricity and so forth. And indeed, this year, in the last couple of months, we have had some momentous moments. For example, the closing of the Radcliffe-on-Soar power station, which closed just a couple of months ago on the 30th of September 2024, which meant this is the last coal-fired power station in Britain. So for the first time for about 150 years, I think, electricity hasn't been made for 150 years, but over 100 years since the first generation of electricity. This is the first time since electricity has now been generated in Britain without the burning of coal, which is really, really interesting. And I remember when I started this project, or started thinking about this project in about 2017, The Guardian reported that the first day of producing electricity without coal had just occurred. Then it was a week, and now it's a permanent thing. So there's a massive transformation of what's going on. And this idea of the end of consumption of coal has followed on the end of the production of coal. So Kellingley Colliery was the last deep mine in Britain, closed in December 2015. And that followed from La Houve in France in 2004 and Prosper Haniel in Germany in 2018. So there are places within Europe that are still mining coal, and I will talk a little about them towards the end of the talk. But there's a kind of, obviously, and we all know this, massive and desired, wanted move from the burning of coal to produce electricity and other things. So again, this was the last deep mine in Scotland, and I snuck through a series of barbed wire fences to take this image sometime in 2020. That was Casterbridge, just over the border from where I am in Fife. So we have this landscape of disappearance, this landscape of absence. So why do this now? Why think about coal being interesting? Why think about coal and the idea of a coalscape as being of use? You know, obviously there is this kind of idea of marking the ending, but I think coal is a lot more interesting and more nuanced than that. And I'm always, almost every time I talk about coal, I always kind of have this quotation from George Orwell, that wrote to Wigan Pier, his Odyssey through the northern kind of counties in 1937, looking at poverty, when he says this: our civilization, what a powerful word, our civilization is founded on coal, more completely than one realizes until one stops to think about it. The machines that keep us alive and the machines that make the machines are all directly or indirectly dependent upon coal. In the metabolism of the Western world, the coal miner is second only in importance to the man who ploughs the soil. He is a sort of grimy caryatid upon whose shoulders nearly everything that is not grimy is supported. Obviously, as a kind of architect historian, I was very interested in the word caryatid, meaning a column in the shape of a human body. So, there's a couple of things interesting here. It's about an idea of labour. It's about an idea of a presence of an awful lot of people who are working in this industry. And secondly, it's about this kind of creation of a culture beyond the coalfields. So everything I've shown so far has been about the coalfields, but there's this kind of idea that this extends in a way that's completely invisible to us, or that we take for granted, that we overlook, or have overlooked. So we have this kind of idea of this workforce. And again, if we think of stereotypes and tropes, this is what they look like. And this is what we kind of tend to imagine they're doing. So this is from 1930s. This is from, again, from the 1930s with very primitive machinery, if you like, tools. In fact, the tools until the 1930s hadn't really changed that much. Okay, he's boring to put in dynamite, but the essential kind of ideas and techniques of mining and the means by which coal was produced hadn't really changed for kind of decades, if not hundreds of years. But, and this is what I became really interested in when I started to kind of investigate this, by the end of the 1950s, it looks a bit like this. It begins to look like this kind of James Mason type figure standing at the bridge of this kind of incredible electronic world, determining the kind of the underground from this point. So there's a kind of notion of mining becoming very rapidly modernized in the second half of the 20th century. So we think of mining as being antiquated, but in fact, mining really kind of comes into its own and produces more coal during the second half of the 20th century. It becomes massively important for a series of things that we now take for granted. And this is part of the argument, actually, that mining has residues and legacies, and a lot of them are actually quite positive for us. Positive in a series of different ways. Obviously taking away the environmental disaster that was burning coal. And this is partly to do with the fact that mining was the first industry to be nationalised. So there's a lot of firsts when it comes to mining. And what I argue in the book, that I'll come to in a second, is there's a lot of seepages that happen from mining, and what happens to miners begins to kind of edge out into broader realms of society and broader parts of the population. So in 1947, it's nationalised, and because it's too important. It's too important to fail. During the First World War, it was quasi-nationalised, and then it struggled on under kind of private ownership, and then they realised, actually, after the Second World War, we need mining. We need it to be it is absolutely central to how we operate. Coal is absolutely essential to everything we do. We need to do this. We need to nationalise. So it becomes nationalised. And then things like, then it becomes involved in a series of what you might call aspects of awareness, of publicity. So, for example, you have the production of a magazine called Coal, which was very popular. And then you have, in 1948, I think, the Miner Comes to Town exhibition. The exhibition was on Oxford Street. It was produced by the Ministry of Information, including people like Misha Black and Robin Day, who contributed to it. And part of it was the idea that you would produce, sorry, move away from the microphone, you would produce in Hyde Park a bandstand in the shape of headgear from a colliery. You know, so the idea that everybody has to know about how important mining is. And part of this obviously is to do with the kind of idea of a new type of miner. They wanted to bring in people into the industry who'd be more like the James Mason character rather than the kind of the guy with the pick and shovel, the idea of a technician rather than a labourer. At the same time, the longest running filmic or cinematic magazine was a Mining Review, which again starts in the 1940s, then disappears 36 years later. 36 years of, I think, a bi-weekly summation of mining, which was distributed across the coalfields and beyond. So when I was a kid, we used to go to the cinema on Saturday morning, and you get the main feature, but you'd also get the Mining Review. You know, it tells you about, like, and obviously I'm going to give some stereotypes here. It will tell you about miners' whippets and kind of pigeon fancy and stuff like that, but also aspects of kind of new technological change, opportunities within mining, etc., etc., etc. So I tried to look at this within this book, which was published by Lund Humphreys and was supported very kindly by the Paul Mellon Centre. And within the book, I divide it into three sections, beginning to think about this idea of architecture, because architecture becomes a thing that we can see, we can feel, it's like obviously it's like an interface. So every time I said I was going to do this book, everybody said, so you're going to go underground then? No, not really, you know. There's not a lot to see underground really. Well, there is, but I'll come to that in a second. But I mean, what is important is the kind of idea of a communication through surface architecture, through what can emerge within both the industry and within civil life. So I divided it into 3 sections. One, and we're going to talk briefly about these this evening, very briefly. Now, I usually, when I'm giving a talk in mine, I usually talk quite a lot about welfare, so I'm going to try and cut that short and get to settlement and publicity. And by publicity, I also mean kind of modernisation. So these are the 3 sections of the book. And so, if you think about those are, if you replace publicity with modernisation, and you think about welfare, settlement and modernisation, you probably have the germs of post-war Britain and the generation, I guess, of a welfare state. So there's an argument within the book that the welfare state kind of finds a nascent form. It emerges within the coal mining industry. This is one of the things I'm saying, one of the kind of positive legacies or residues we have from this, and we have from miners and their kind of legitimate agitations, is a welfare state system. And to kind of give and a welfare state system which, again, or a welfare kind of situation which emerged in the mining community very much through architecture. So we come, and some people, the story involves people who are quite well known and people who are more shadowy, etc. So, for example, on your left, there's someone who's slightly more shadowy. This is John Henry Forshaw, who becomes the chief architect of the Miners' Welfare Commission. And he was employed, well, he was partly engaged in that position by, I think, Patrick Abercrombie, who was part of the commission who hired him. Patrick Abercrombie is obviously an incredibly influential and famous town planner, one of the kind of initiators of town planning within Britain. So John Henry Forshaw arrives in the kind of mid-1920s, round about that period. And it's complex, I'm not going to go into too much, but basically he assembles around him a crowd of very young architects. And they seem to have a lot of fun as well, because this is their kind of dinner card for the Cheshire Cheese pub. Forshaw is the man at the back who's kicking them all onto the pub for their dinner. And he assembles this series of very young, mostly male, but there were some females involved when I looked through the records. Most of the records for this are in the National Archives in Kew. There's a treasure trove of stuff there, a lot of which hasn't been looked at. So these were young men, male mainly, but some young females who were given an incredible amount of responsibility for building buildings up and down the country. And the buildings that they were mainly involved in, the buildings which are most conspicuous architecturally, were about this. And just before I show this, you might just imagine what impact this architecture has. It was about kind of translating the top of the image to the bottom of the image. So the top of the image is what we, I guess, think about when we think about miners in the 20th century. Somehow, the trope, the idea of having a bath in front of the fire, filth, dirt. And if you think about what that actually meant, and because this was true, this is partly true. So if you think about what that actually meant for the miner, for the miner's family, for the miner's spouse or partner, and for their domestic environment, it was an absolute catastrophe. So they were saying that if a miner at the time worked 12 hours a day, his spouse would work 15 hours a day, because she would have to kind of clear up probably for multiple shifts coming in. The man of the house, the husband, plus the sons, when they're old enough, would all work in the mine. And then there was this kind of running program, because quite often they would occupy different shifts. So you have that situation happening throughout the country. So there was agitation for these things called pithead baths, which represent the bottom of the image, where men, and it was men for specific reasons, I can go into that later on if you please, but for men to wash and leave all their dirt at the place of work. So this was a kind of radical departure, not only because it produced, and as I'm going to argue in a second, some fantastically amazing architecture, but also because of the impact it had on everyday life within domestic dwellings across the coalfields and beyond. And how did they do this? Well, first of all, they kind of borrowed an aesthetic and an idea. So they looked mainly at this guy, Dudok, who is between the wars, an incredibly influential Dutch architect who built this, amongst other things. This is the town hall in Hilversum. And this became a kind of landscape that they occupied with the buildings that they made. And the Hilversum town hall represented what became known as what was known as a Stadtkroon, a city crown. This like idea of a building which became a kind of civic centre, which exercised, if you like, a civilizing influence over the people who experienced it somehow. Yeah? So that's what's happening in Hilversum. So there's a kind of idea that they began to take this form and began to develop this across the coalfields in the form of these pithead baths. So one thing to say about this is it's a kind of acceptable modernism. It's an acceptable modernist architecture. It's not an extreme modernist architecture. It's quite a middle-of-the-road modernist architecture. It's made out of brick as opposed to white stuff. So Dudok was kind of, I suppose, on the more conservative end of modernist architecture. But anyway, so the guys, John Forshaw and his colleagues, made a series of buildings which look like this. You can see, probably you can begin to see the Dudokian influence. There's usually a counterplay of horizontal and vertical forms. The vertical forms are necessary to kind of hold the water, which is necessary for the baths to make that, to give them the pressure. And you can see that there's a range. They were arranged, the teams, well, the overall team was arranged in smaller teams, and each team had responsibility for a certain geographical area across the country. So you can see that we have a range here of a geographical spread from South Wales to across to kind of Fife, and then the last two on the bottom right hand side represent the north and south extreme from Betshanger in Kent to the smallest, or one of the smallest of the pithead baths, which is Brora in Sutherland. So all these places. And you've got to remember, the interesting thing about coal is it doesn't emerge in a uniform way. It can be anywhere. It can be, you can find coal mines in cities, or coal mines in Manchester, or coal mines in Bolton. You can find it in valleys, you can find it in mountains, you can find it in moorland. It's scattered around. So quite often these places, these modernist forms erupted kind of in the middle of nowhere, and were kind of seen almost like Catherine Glazier, a kind of agitator for the pithead bath, described the program, the future program as it was when she said it was, as white shining temples of health emerging. So there's this kind of idea about these things being transformative. And just to say that some of these pithead baths would service 5,000 men per day, and some of them would service maybe 30, but they're all arranged under the same principle. And I'm not going to go into this too much here, but there's something to do with the plan. This kind of idea of a separation of dirty and clean sides. So to go from one side of the pithead baths to the other, you have to go through the filter, and the filter is the showers. So you come in. So basically every miner has two sets of lockers. They have a clean locker and they have a dirty locker. And when they come from the pit into the dirty locker, they leave their dirty clothes there, going through the filter, and then come into another space, which is the clean side, and they get into their home clothes and they go home. And then they were expected to wash their clothes once a week. So every single one of these pithead baths, and we reckon, and I'm going to talk about why we reckon this, we reckon there was only over 800 of these made. And we reckon that they serviced 600,000 men per day. Think of that for impact. The only other modernist, if you like, the only other modernist initiative which comes close to that arguably is the London Underground. But the London Underground isn't necessarily completely for working class people, whereas this is. So this is what makes this type of architecture incredibly radical and incredibly rare, and has been mostly overlooked within kind of historiographies of British architecture, arguably. Yeah, it's partly to do with like taking this system, which was the continental system, and making it better because this is a suspension system where the dirty clothes and clean clothes are all intermingled up above. So they critiqued that and made this new system that I've just shown in the plans. And each had this amazing. Each miner had these 2 lockers in different zones within the building, which are very kind of really interesting modernist pieces in themselves, and they were all there common. So while the architecture might change on the outside, the interior were all kind of edified, if you like, by this type of fitment. You can also see the idea of light, the light pouring in from above, and the kind of idea of the white shining temples of light. So light is really important, and how light pours into these buildings from various places, quite often from above, is really important in how they're designed. And again, it's taken from Dudok. And again, the idea of the lockers being linked to a plenum. So the lockers actually, they not only stored the clothes, they also dried the clothes. So they had hot air pumped through lockers, etc. So it's an incredibly sophisticated kind of idea of the movement of air and the movement of men through these spaces. And as I said, 3,000, sometimes 3,000 per day, quite often with a canteen as well, which serves 3,000 meals per day. So an amazing kind of production line of movement and servicing for the immediate good of the miners, but the indirect good of their spouses, partners, and domestic circumstances. Some of them are amazing. This is one in Scotland. Look at the clear story lighting, which penetrates deep into the interior of the building. This was known locally as the spaceship, for obvious reasons. You can also imagine if at this time of the year in Scotland, it's dark about 4 o'clock. So you can imagine that we're seeing it in light, but most of the time you'd see this as a kind of beacon, shining light across the landscape and you can see also what the rest of the colliery looked like. The rest of the colliery is a kind of 19th century piece of rubbish compared to this kind of new, modernist, kind of futuristic world, which comes with its own kind of curvy landscaping as well. Incidentally, just in case you were wondering, the separate system operates even within circular buildings. So to get from one side to the other, you have to go through the central filter, which is the showers, which occupy the kind of the inner ring. And there's obviously an indoor, there's a dirty door and there's a clean door for in and out. And just to say again, this is from, and they began to think about this, began to talk about this, began to publicise this. So this is the end of year report from 1938, I think, showing what happened in 1937 and 1936, and showing the number of buildings that had been made. So each one of the blocks at the bottom is a building, and each man represents 1,000 men. So it's an incredibly ambitious program running out to kind of generate this new world. So that's welfare. I wanted to talk a little bit about settlement. Settlement, again, we have a variety of kind of, I say tropes, but they were real. This was reality. This is Lumpenhans in Fife, which again was a kind of, you know, I was going to say one step up from a slum-ish, kind of not great facilities, not great outside facilities, not great inside facilities, kind of built probably in the beginning by the owners of mines themselves. So there's quite a lot of tied housing, especially in Scotland. But I just want to talk about another person that you may have heard of who's quite famous. This is Raymond Unwin, who is the kind of one of the father figures. Obviously, Ebenezer Howard was the kind of initiator of this idea, but with Barry Parker, Raymond Unwin developed the idea of the Garden City at places like Letchworth and places like Hampstead. But what is kind of lesser known about Raymond Unwin was he grew up and he worked to begin with in collieries in round about Chesterfield. So this is actually, funnily enough, This is, he wouldn't be proud of this. This is one of Raymond Unwin's kind of earliest works. He kind of produced these kind of quasi-slum dwellings as a young man. He worked as a kind of draftsman within this. So, and you can see at the top is the colliery, so it's very much a kind of intimate relationship with the colliery. But you can also see he's beginning to think about this. This is beginning to think about, like, as he talks about going down a mine. He becomes obsessed with light, with cleanliness. You can kind of, in fresh air, you can kind of see why. And interestingly enough, he writes about his experience in going down a mine in the Commonwealth. And it's the same edition in which William Morris is writing How We Live and How We Might Live. So there's a really interesting moment there between these two people coming together within this journal. So he begins to think about kind of mining and think about alternatives to that. So we have this idea of the rural hamlet. But I argue that the rural hamlet, he has a precedent from somebody you probably almost certainly haven't known about. And it's this guy here, a guy called Percy Houghton, or Percy Houghton. It was autocorrecting that to Houston, but I'm glad it hasn't done that. Who was designing places like this, which is New Bolsover. But becomes, which again is it's a model mining town. It has attributes. It's interesting, but it's not quite where we want to what we want to talk about. But what's more interesting is he goes in for and wins a competition for cheap cottages for Letchworth Garden City. So this was a massive. There was two competitions. This was the one from 1905, and he produces this prototype. Which is not really that well known, which is a kind of double-fronted cottage. You can see it's stripped down and quite bare. You can also see that it's probably designed to be kind of extended. It doesn't stand alone. It's part of a bigger terrace. In this case, it was built as and funnily enough, he won this cheap cottage. And I make the argument kind of in the book, without not being too forcefully, but I kind of make the argument that this is the type of a great deal of British council housing, that this becomes repeated in a series of different ways and becomes kind of embedded within council housing. So, and again, what's really interesting is the plan becomes refined later on, but the idea of the living room having kind of dual aspect and this notion of a kind of light flooding in from both sides, which becomes really important and to Raymond Unwin, and he talks about this. So Raymond Unwin and Percy Houghton, I don't know what the relationship is, but I think they know each other, and there's certainly a kind of a play of influence forward and back. Incidentally, this form of council housing still exists. And it's in Letchworth, and it's at number 247 Icknield Way, and you can have a look at it in Google Maps. It's still there. And if you look at everything else around about it, you can see how incredibly, interestingly simple and austere, yet quite quality. I don't know what quite good. You know, you can see that. So Percy Houghton does this in 1910, which is a kind of garden suburb, if you like, near Doncaster. What's missing from the drawing is the presence of the massive colliery, which is just kind of over here-ish. What's again interesting is Patrick Abercrombie writes a review about this, and Nicholas Pevsner writes a review about this, and somewhat sniffily says, I don't see what's kind of interesting about this. It just looks like every other council estate. You know, in fact, that's the kind of point, because within this, he uses exclusively, or he kind of extensively uses his double-fronted cottage, and then you can see again in places like Letchworth. So, for example, this is Cromwell Gardens, designed by Parker and Unwin, and you can see that the same double-fronted thing is there. So it becomes a typology. So it's very, very influential on Raymond Unwin, and then you can see how there is a relationship between it and the housing type D from the Tudor-Walters report from 1919, which again sets in train the idea of council housing. Now, Raymond Unwin was incredibly influential on that report. So there's this kind of idea that it's become linked within the DNA. Coal mining has become embedded within the DNA of British council housing and the idea perhaps of the garden city and the garden suburb. There's other examples as well. This is John Tudor Waters himself, about slightly after that, who's designing a series of, I can't remember, about 18 to 20 villages in this we produced a book about it, the building of 12,000 houses for the Industrial Housing Association, but it was almost completely to do with mining. And what's really interesting is you can see that there's this kind of very strong focus on an idea of double aspect and light flooding in from both sides to these rooms. So the kind of idea of opening up, the idea of getting rid of backs, of having a very kind of intimate relationship between inside and outside, this kind of idea of space, which I mean arguably comes from a notion of maybe the antithesis of a miner's working environment. Again, on this we have Patrick Abercrombie again, and the development of regional plans. This is Kent, and again, this is in the 1920s, and you can see that Patrick Abercrombie is drawing Kent according to a kind of the exigencies of an extractive industry. So what happens on the top of Kent in his new plan is completely there to facilitate the extraction of what happens below. So this notion of coal becoming kind of central to how Kent will, or East Kent at least, will develop and expand under a plan. And then a little bit more whimsically, this is Aylsham, and it was actually built, but you can see that actually it's built in the form of a headgear which has been laid flat. So slightly bizarre, but it was actually built like this. And then from this you kind of have influence into the new towns movement, and there's something to be said about this as well. I mean, a lot of the new towns outside the London new towns, were built in coalfields or former coalfields, and these are two of the most conspicuous. Peterlee, which was begun by Dennis Lasdun and was developed by Victor Passmore, was described as the miner's citadel. And then Glenrothes, which is in Fife, which was built to service a new super pit called Rothes Colliery. But just have a look at Glenrothes, because what's really interesting about it, it's a town of roundabouts and circulation. So it's a town of perpetual flow. It's designed to establish this kind of idea of motor cars, but the idea of a kind of frictionless a frictionless plan for an urban situation. And this is what's happening underground actually as well. So this is from the 90s. So we're now on to publicity modernisation, and this is a kind of, again, a propaganda piece about the mines of yesterday and the mines of tomorrow, which is left and right respectively. And you can see some of the things I've talked about. So if you look at the top on the left hand side, you see the kind of old Victorian mine with all its bits and pieces, etc. And if you look at the top on the right hand side, you can see a kind of sleek, kind of flat roofed edifice. And what's happening underneath is the development of what's called horizontal mining, which is the kind of the idea of mining not following seams but cutting through seams, because with that you can begin to generate haulage systems which are far more efficient, etc. So the idea of this kind of abstract geometry being applied to the underground, where everything becomes geometrically related to how you pull coal horizontally and vertically to the surface. So the idea of circulation, the idea of a frictionless world. Incidentally, on the surface, they also developed this series of transport systems which had the wonderful name of merry-go-round trains, which went from pit to power station, and they never stopped. They just went really slowly, and then went fast, and then went really slowly, and then went fast as they got to the respective places of loading and uploading. And this comes from the plan for coal, which was a massively huge and hugely ambitious programme set forth in the 1950s, which looked at how coal was going to develop, how it was going to be the mainstay of the welfare state, of the new Britain, of the white heat of industrial and technological progress. It was going to cost an enormous amount of money, as you can see. It was going to do this through three forms of rationalisation: reconstruction of existing pits, closures of worked out pits. And it's interesting to talk about closures, because closures always happen, because coal mining was always peripatetic, always moved to where there was coal deposits, so there were always built-in obsolescence. So by the time in the 1950s, Nicholas Pevner's talking about pithead baths in his Buildings of England series. He talks about pithead baths in Northumbria, already been demolished like decades before. This is only in the 1950s. So anyway, and finally the construction of new pits. And this meant the construction of 12 new deep collieries, super pits, but also numerous drift mines and open cast mines. There were 38 new shafts sunk between 1947 and 1954. Now, in terms of investment, to build a coal mine takes about 15 years from the initial boring to the production of the first load of coal. So imagine the amount of investment before you get a return. So it's a kind of idea about this huge faith in the future. So these emerged like this: Lee Hall, Agecroft. These are some of the new super pits built with extended kind of aspects of technological systems, new remote systems. So they were testing how you can actually get coal out without miners using a thing called a ROLF system. Again, the kind of idea of these kind of modernist kind of ideas of flow, etc. And then in Scotland, I wanted to talk a little bit about this, because in Scotland, the super pits was the most comprehensive system. It was a system of new pits. It was also a system of new settlements, and it also produced the best architecture, arguably. This, for example, is Seafield Colliery, and this is designed by another really interesting character who has been much overlooked, a guy called Egon Rees, who was educated in Vienna, was Jewish, ended up as a refugee in London, lived in Isakon, and designed the donkey bookcase. And actually, before he came to London, he actually, in his 20s, he designed a whole series of amazing buildings in Vienna. And nobody's really pieced these, well, I'm hoping to do this, but nobody's really pieced these aspects of his life together to make a comprehensive kind of realization of what he was and what he did and how he contributed. So he's still slightly shadowy. I mean, a lot of other people who lived in Isakon are a lot more famous than he is. Again, this is Bilston Glen. These are all names from my childhood, because there was always, during the strike and stuff I can remember, board-marked concrete. And finally, the first of all these super pits, the one which was the epitome of the modernisation of the industry, was Rothes. Rothes was a disaster. Functionally, it worked. It only operated for, I think, about 10 years and closed down. But funnily enough, the towers that you can see, it was his most comprehensive design, really interesting, but the towers you can see were not demolished until the 1990s. So in other words, they witnessed the coal strike, they witnessed everything, and then eventually they were still there, and eventually they brought them down, just when people were thinking they could be interesting to keep, because they're a really interesting aspect of our heritage. So that's kind of the first project I want to talk about. The second two projects are going to be a lot shorter, so don't worry. So the second one is this, which is something I'm involved with the 20th Century Society at the moment. We had a symposium just a few weeks ago, and it's looking at this legacy of the pithead baths buildings. We've had, again, support from the Paul Mellon Centre in its collaboration grant, which allowed me to work with them. And we've been touring Scotland, England and Wales. We're trying to find these buildings, these 800, we don't even know, is there 600, is there 800, we're thinking about 800, where they are. The one that you see on the right hand side is that's a recent photograph, that's Tower in South Wales, and what we've done is we've established a kind of map system, so you can go online to the C20 website and begin to kind of explore, or begin to kind of tell us if you know about pithead baths. So we started this preliminary kind of mapping system through items I retrieved from the archives, the National Archives in Kew, etc. So that's an ongoing project, and we're going to look for more funding, I think, to build an exhibition about this, because, again, the story of the pithead baths and its impact and influence I don't think has had sufficient acknowledgement. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about, you can see there's no hyphen in Coalscape here, it hasn't been auto-corrected, which is a relief. It's just this notion of what happened then, because I wrote that book and then I started to think about, what does all this mean? Is this just about Britain then, or something else happened? And then you begin to look and see about this kind of idea of the coalscapes throughout Britain. So I decided I was going to make an application to the European Research Council to see if I can think about, throughout Europe rather, think about how this project might be extended. But then it can't just be extended, it can't just be geographically about the same thing but just spread wider. It's this kind of idea about, what is it I'm dealing with here? And then I was drawn to Lewis Mumford, who said this, for the eminent historian and philosopher of technology, Lewis Mumford, coal mining both established and epitomised the capitalist exploitation of both land and labour. He described the space of the mines as the first completely manufactured landscape, an unnatural, inorganic antithesis of the ideal pastoral Arcadia. Mining, he argued, was the archetypal site where earth and land were reconceived as being no longer just about growing food, but as something more instrumental, something that could be objectively acted or operated upon. I thought that was really interesting because it seems to suggest mining was the beginnings of pretty much everything else, how we think about the land, how we think about the world and something. And then I was drawn to these drawings which came out of Bohemia in this book by Georgios Agricola, di Re Metallica, which is about mineral mining but also mentions coal mining, and the idea about how this was visualised and the idea about how technologies to do with mining became transferred across mining areas. And you begin to realise that according to Mumford and according to Agricola, there's certain things that happen in common. There's certain things that are universal concerning mining. And you think, okay, this is really a really interesting territory to explore and needs to be explored. I had to limit it somehow, so I kind of limited it to Europe. So I called it ACME, I was pleased with that. Architecture of Coal Mining in Modern Europe. I spent ages in that. On my third attempt, it's not easy to get an ERC grant. On my third attempt, they gave it to me. So I have an advanced grant which will start in March and run for 60 months. And I'm just going to finish up by talking a little bit what I hope to do. Again, the idea of labour being central to this. And I began to, in the application incidentally is 25,000 words. So it begins to kind of look at where mining was and where mining is and where mining is no more, I suppose. So, and begins to kind of map out these kind of ways in which it manifested itself and thinks about and describes this notion of architecture being the transmitter of both technological and social innovation. We saw that social innovation and technological innovation in the site of the pithead baths, and begins to suggest there's a series of new ecologies or what should be thought of ecologies, forms, systems, networks and connections that existed both within and across the buildings and landscape that coal mining created. And then these are the kind of research themes which I've called ecologies, settlements and housing. So some of this is drawing upon what I've done before, but some of this is kind of trying to think about and may even critique what I've done, trying to think about other spheres as well. So the idea of settlements and housing, that's a garden city in Poland, medical and hygiene, pithead baths, education and exchange, library of the École des Mines in Paris. There's loads of libraries which were realised through mines or mining, schools of mines rather. The modernised industry, how that began to shape Europe. So you have like the beginning of the EU. Many people know the beginning of the EU is the coal and steel community, and this kind of transnational kind of way in which coal and steel were kind of exchanged and organised, which is really, really interesting. And then the idea of excavating the coalscape, idea of what it might mean, which I'm kind of beginning to evoke tonight, and also the idea of what happens after it ends. the idea of endings, etc. And then there's modes of inquiry, so I'm going to look at them very closely. The architecture and the idea of cultural landscapes, ephemera, how it's discussed, because coal, because of the idea of controversy, coal emerges, because coal has always been controversial since the very beginning, but that means, because of that, it emerges in cultural landscapes a lot. It's discussed a lot in films, it's discussed a lot in novels, etc. It's discussed a lot in ephemera and leaflets and pamphlets, etc., etc. And then most importantly, I think, is the idea that architecture is obviously a visual thing, and I come from an architectural rather than an architectural history background. I trained as an architect. The idea that we can make drawings, we can begin to map things, we can look at things very close visually and very far out visually as well, and make this kind of idea of the landscape of coal mining present. So there's an idea that this will be a kind of digital archive as well as part of this, and very complicated diagram, which has me at the middle of it because I was pitching for the grant at the time, which has 3 PhD students, two PhD students, 3 postdocs, advisory boards, conferences, and all this kind of stuff, and trying to organise how this might emerge, with the end point of this idea that there's a coal mining episteme, the coalscape. And I when I was writing the bid, I thought about, there was a lot of talk about the oilscape, which is which was coined, I think, by Hewn, and the idea that I was looking at energy humanities and beginning to think about that, and they're all about oil. And I thought, well, really interestingly, I don't think you can fully understand oil until you understand coal, because coal, I think, is this form that precedes everything, that allows us kind of, according to Munford, allows us change in how we view nature, how we view the world, and how that emerged. And as I said, it emerges through a series of infrastructures. It emerges through a series of pieces of architecture and repositories of knowledge. And at the end, I'm hoping that the project will provide a critical new piece of infrastructure with which to rethink the intimacies between our energy sources, extractive industries, cultural and social lives, and the built environment that have contributed to the Anthropocene. And that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Gary. This was a real sort of went through multiple landscapes in many ways, and I feel like I learned a lot. I do have a question, and I can start unless there's anything pressing in the room or online. Okay, so I think my main question was around, I found it really interesting that you were looking at, sort of form and architectural form, and thinking about hygienic modernity in some sense, and kind of what was good, kind of useful for the coal miner, and kind of indirectly also good for their spouses and things like that. But I was curious about where the political scape was in the coalscape as well, and I think thinking about the good of the miner, the good of the spouse, the good of the state, the good of capitalist enterprise, and sort of where those things align, as well as how sort of, I think quite specifically, the pit head baths and hygienic modernity and the kind of efficiency model, where that the form political function as well as a kind of a broader social function align.
Yeah, and if I understand your question correctly, there's a kind of idea of paternalism within how it emerges, and that's undoubtedly there. But I think that what's really interesting also is that the Miners' Welfare Commission was partly contained representatives from coal owners, i.e. capitalists, from the state, who are trying to mediate, I suppose, and from the unions. So there's a kind of trifold thing, so there's a kind of a chord across that. There was controversy. Some of the miners didn't want pit head baths, So you have a commission partly into conditions in coal mining in general called the Sankey Commission in 1921, where pithead baths came up as part of the discussion, and they had witnesses, if you like, from all over the coalfields, and some of the people who expressed absolute desire for pithead baths were miners' wives. So there's a kind of, I think it's, funnily enough, the discussion at the C20 symposium we had recently, we had this kind of, again, this notion of, was it top down or bottom up? And I kind of think it was both. It was a kind of fabric of kind of gendered perspective from women who had kind of domestic work to do. We had kind of we had agitation from unions. We had lots of kind of people who wanted it, and then the original idea, and again there is paternalism running through this, but the idea of some of the pithead baths where they were supposed to be pedagogic, that they were supposed to demonstrate how good this would be. So there was a series of experimental ones which were set up in the early 1920s in each of the coalfields. Well, actually, in one in Scotland, one in England, and one in Wales, and they were designed to demonstrate to miners what the benefits of this would be.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. You started today by talking about the end of coal, in essence. And I wondered, therefore, if you'd had any thoughts yet, sort of almost going beyond the congratulations on getting the EIRC award, by the way. What are we going to learn from the decommissioning of coalscapes? And I was kind of thinking, Max Boyce, the pithead baths are a supermarket now. and I kind of get quite depressed by the decommissioning. Am I just ridiculously nostalgic? I'm interested to hear what you think about that.
Well, again, it's a really interesting question, and it's a really complex question. I think, as I said, like, coal mining was always about obsolescence. So they were knocking things down, in the 1930s they were getting rid of stuff, and so that's always going on. I do think that. And then there's obviously a massive health and safety thing about aspects of this as well. But I think there's also a political agenda about getting rid of aspects of coal mining and what actually represented in terms of labour, in terms of a kind of idea of work. And I think it's really interesting that coal was visceral. So in terms of, to use that word again, the oilscape, you don't really know where oil comes from, whereas my granny knew how much coal was on a weekly basis, and she'd handle coal, and she'd had their coal in the grate, so there's a kind of real kind of sense of everybody knew miners. And actually, when we've been doing all these talks, like, so many people have come up and said, like, my grandfather was a miner, or my great-grandfather was a miner, or I came, and it's really incredible. What we found is, it is scary, like that we went to the site of, remember the spaceship one? We went to the site and tried to find where it was, and it's not just gone. It's completely obliterated. It's absolutely no trace whatsoever. And we did the same with one of the ones that's featured in Pevsner's Northumbria book and the Buildings of England series as well. And in fact, just absolutely no trace, not just of the building, but no trace there was mining there. Unless you went with a shovel and kind of dug up stuff and tried to find black things, that's about all you can get. So, but we are finding, funnily enough, in terms of the pithead baths, there are quite a lot. We found, I think, about 30 or 40 that are still in existence, which is better than I thought we were going to do. And what is also interesting is, because the places of production have been destroyed, they're all gone. But the Miners' Welfare Commission did other things as well. It did things within the community. So if you go to mining areas, you'll find lots of stuff. Libraries, institutes, bandstands, recreational kind of facilities, landscapes were all put in place by the Miners' Welfare Commission. But I haven't talked about them very much, but they're there in plain sight. So the heritage and legacy is still there. And that's kind of heartwarming. But I think there is, if you look at the way that Germany, and I've done some work, a little bit of work in the Ruhr, I was there for a while. If you look how they acknowledge their mining heritage, and you look how Britain's acknowledged hers, there's a massive gulf. You know, they're quite proud of it, actually. There's lots and lots of heritage, lots and lots of kind of celebratory heritage there that we kind of tend not to have so much of. So I think there is a kind of political decision. Plus the fact the Ruhr, which is one of the poorest places in Germany, has still benefited from massive amounts of investment into kind of social facilities post-mining, you know, which has meant the population hasn't kind of become as left behind as arguably it has in Britain.
Thank you. That was really fascinating, thinking through a lot of things. I wanted to ask you whether there was any kind of religious or spiritual connections with the kind of architectural ideas, particularly around building places for communal gathering, whether that's bathing or, you know, not for worship, and I'm thinking particularly like people like Unwin and connections with Letchworth, which were very much inspired by this kind of late 19th, early 20th century arts and crafts socialism, which had, you know, deep connections with things like theosophy and, you know, sort of spiritualist ideas or philosophies. So it seems sort of not very connected on the surface to industry and coal, but I'm just wondering whether some of those ideas, which are kind of about the histories of socialism and social thought, and particularly in Britain, have any relationship to what you were showing us here.
Again, I think it's a really interesting question. It's very rich. I mean, obviously with Unwin, etc., you have what, Edwin Carpenter and all that kind of world. And with miners, there's, I mean, the thing about miners is that it kind of, it can be a slight trope, but at the same time, I think there is a truth in it, that it breeds a sense of community and solidarity, because when you're underground, you can imagine, I mean, I don't know how many people here have been underground, and if you have, probably not on a regular basis, but if you're underground on a regular basis, you're completely dependent on everybody working together to ensure collective safety. You know, so there's a kind of incredible kind of a sense of solidarity which grew up around that and manifested itself in different ways on the surface. And sometimes that was to do with, like, you know, socialism and communism, etc., and sometimes it was to do with religion. So, for example, in Germany and in Poland, etc., there's a great kind of reverence to an idea of St. Barbara, who's the kind of patron saint of miners. In Britain, it's probably more, I'd say, more became politicized in a kind of more secular way. But you've got to remember that, like, the idea of Dudok and that was Dudok's. Well, it's not Dudok's idea, but the idea of the city crown, which emerged in the 19s, was the idea of that was a kind of cathedral, but a cathedral of socialism. Rather, you know, so it's but obviously, you know, there's a kind of mirror there, isn't there, between the kind of idea of spirituality and an idea of kind of socialism. The two things mirror each other. So it's something I haven't looked at so much, but I do think that religion was important, especially in certain places. And one thinks maybe of Wales and kind of Methodism and stuff like that, you know, and kind of Protestantism and stuff like that. So. But certainly, I think would certainly merit further investigation.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi. Excuse me. Thanks. That was brilliant. I had a question about the kind of afterlife of the coalscape, as you said, going forward, excavating these things, and touching on kind of like the decommissioning points. My granddad was a miner in Manvers in South Yorkshire, and on the site where Manvers was now is the largest next distribution warehouse in the country. And can we talk about the architecture of coal without talking about the architecture of what's come now? And that is, for a large amount of communities, massive distribution sheds with very insecure working patterns. None of the, you know, innovations of the bathhouses that we saw. I just thought, have you taken any consideration of that in kind of bringing that forward into development of your theory at all?
That's certainly what I'm going to look at as part of this ERC thing, you know, because it's looking at the kind of I'm supposed to write a monograph, which is the last work package, if you like, or the last theme, in which it's going to start at the end, I think, you know. So the end point's going to be, so the rest of it's going to be before that, and then there's a hinge point and the end point, and then my monograph is going to look at that, and it's exactly, you know, what I'm going to look at is how these places have changed socially and kind of spatially, you know, and begin to kind of excavate that. But I think it's absolutely bang on, you know. And my hometown of Falkirk is just like, I don't know, it's like mainly call centres now and stuff like that, whereas it was coal and iron and steel even when I was a boy, they still were there. So there's a huge shift in that kind of culture, and as I said earlier, a lot of these places have never really, there's been, you know, serial, you know, generationally unemployment and stuff like that. So it's incredible transformation.
There's an online question that is sort of quite similar to that question, so I'll ask it now. And it's from Anonymous. It says, thank you very much for the presentation, etc. Very inspiring. In light of the increasing number of abandoned mines in the UK, I came across an article discussing the potential of utilizing geothermal energy from abandoned mines. What are your thoughts on the feasibility and potential of repurposing abandoned mines for geothermal energy or perhaps other innovative applications? Could this represent a sustainable solution to both energy needs and land reclamation challenges?
Yes, hopefully. I think it's brilliant. We've talked about it a little bit. We've been looking at the pithead. We're chatting about pithead baths in Lothian and what they might do with it, and the idea that it might be something that could be kind of heated for free is really, really intriguing, because, you know, if you manage to do that, then what would that do to those areas that have been deprived? If you got like, well, we settle here, you know, there's free heat, you know. So I think it should absolutely be invested in and absolutely looked at. I think that there's a massive landscape underground, you know, of these. I mean, obviously the mines tend to flood very quickly, but there's a massive infrastructure which is, you know, nobody knows how extensive it is. There was an amazing fact actually that I came across, and like an idiot, I lost the source, so I couldn't use it in my book. But it was so it's still apocryphal. But it was this notion that during the 1970s, 1960s and 70s, the NUM were producing more miles of tunnel per year than existed in the whole of the London Underground system, which is kind of extraordinary if you think about that. So all that's still there. Obviously, some of it's, you know, kind of crumbled, but you know, there is an amazing kind of opportunity there for someone to kind of to investigate, explore, and do some research on that.
Well, thanks for a fascinating talk, and I really particularly like the bit about the coal industry trying to present a modern face. And the bars were obviously an example of that. But I think there's an interesting point which ties in with what you were just saying now, that you know, the most extraordinary thing about mines are these incredible underground developments. And of course, what you showed is above ground. It's not the core of the working mine. It sort of echoes a fairly, I mean, it's interesting, this business about the image of the minefield. I mean, I suppose a lot of people would think of slag heaps for a start, and those bathhouses are almost the opposite of the slag heap in terms of connotations, and slag heaps are still very much with us.
Yeah, yeah, they are, yeah.
So I think that sort of underground, overground sort of thing, and there is almost a way it's almost as if I find it fascinating that those buildings that you showed, both in terms of their function and their look, are kind of the opposite of what happens underground, which is of course relatively rarely shown. We have lots of images of different kinds of steel working and that sort of thing. there are images, the famous Henry Moore images of miners and that
Yeah.
sort of thing. But very rarely is there much exploration, or visual exploration of what goes on underground. And I think if you saw, so my question is there any way when you look at these new developments, the bars and that sort of thing, what is the relationship between what they evoke in terms of what a mine is and what a coal mine is, given there's all the stuff underground, it's trying to do away with the dirt and clean the dirt with which it's normally associated. And I wonder, is there anything in that contrast that would be...
Yeah, I think, again, it's a great question. I think that what they are trying to do is provide the antithesis, and if you can imagine, and Raymond Unwin, as I said in the Commonweal, has this description of coming out from underground and coming to the light and what it meant to him because it had been deprived. And then if you can imagine coming out and being presented with a building which was full of light, full of heat, full of cleanliness, full of nutrition, after the deprivations of being underground, I think the contrast is absolutely deliberate. That it was like, this is not going to have anything to do with what it's like under there. It's going to be absolutely the opposite. And obviously within that, it hooks into kind of other themes and trends within modernism, with white architecture and cleanliness of planes and precision of thinness of fittings and stuff, and the idea of light coming deep within things. Even if you look at the way the taps work, the taps are highly polished. So they're constantly kind of, reflecting light. The lockers made of silvered aluminium as well. It's like kind of the whole thing is about this kind of, and I think that's what's amazing about it. There is. The other thing is, I'd say that we don't know much about. If again, you'll find that in the publicity department of the NUM, they did a live television program from a mine in Scotland and stuff like that. They're always trying to get down there and do stuff, but it was actually quite difficult to do, because of the risk of explosions, etc., from kind of electrical implements in terms of film and cameras and stuff like that. But they're trying to do that. But I think the Pithead Bath was about the antithesis, and I think the rest of it became about that as well, because the interesting thing is if you make a factory, you define the limits, whereas a mine underground, there's no definition. Your limits change every day. So, everything's moving. You're either moving far from the kind of pit bottom where the shaft comes down, or you're moving towards the pit bottom. So every day you kind of have to, the whole process of being in a shift is, the shift has to kind of move the machinery from the previous shift's work to the next place. So all the boundaries and limits change. So I think by the time we enter the modernist era in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a desire to make the things on the surface as predictable and as beautiful and as clean as possible. So I think that and I think that continues what the Pithead Baths has started.
I have quite a few questions online. I'll ask them one at a time.
Okay.
So from S. Smith, who says, in the 80s, I lived next to a retired Polish miner who came to the UK during World War II. Are you researching the impact of miners' migration, both internationally, but also within the UK as mines came and went?
I haven't been, but I hope to. It is really interesting. There's massive amounts of, for example, Italian miners end up in Belgium. There is a whole kind of part of Sardinia which is, has a new, I just found this out, has a new town called Carbonia, which is really interesting as well. So obviously you had Polish miners in Britain, you had Hungarian miners came over, so there's and then the Ruhr as well, Romanian miners, Turkish miners. So it's a really interesting kind of another legacy the kind of internationalization.
Thanks. And Andrew Dimitris asks, says, great to hear praise from for Egon Rees, the lost man of British modernism. Could it be argued that his work in Scotland, even the remains of the Rothes colliery, was a high point of modernist architecture? And do you have a book on Rees in preparation?
But yes. Hopefully, I'm beginning to look at investigating Rees. And yeah, there are a few remnants around the place, including bits and pieces at Rothes, which is really interesting. The main towers are gone, but some of the venting, the concrete venting kind of, what would you call them, trumpets almost, are still there. Yeah, it's a really interesting series of fragments, and unfortunately, Egon Rees is very mysterious. There's no sign of his own personal papers, which is going to make kind of producing anything original on him quite difficult. But I hope to go to Vienna in the next kind of while and have a look there and see what I can do. He wrote a book about the development of Vienna, a kind of proposal, a project, which has been overlooked as well. So he has these 3 lives. He has a life in Vienna. He has this kind of intermission life in Isakon, and then he has his final life in Scotland. Where he's overlooked. People don't really know much about him anymore.
2 more. One from Mark Crinson, who says, what can be said about mining tourism? I'm intrigued, for instance, by the working replica mine which was built and dug as a pavilion in the grounds of the Wembley Empire exhibition in 1924. People could experience going down in a lift to the galleries below. Beyond a kind of fairground thrill, what was that really about?
This was in the British Empire, one of the British Empire
Wembley
exhibitions,
exhibition,
because there's bits. I mean, in 1951 at the Festival of Britain, they had bits and pieces on mining as well, and then in 1938 in Glasgow in the Empire exhibition, there was bits and pieces. I don't know whether. I mean, it is that particular one in Wembley. It felt like a very strange thing. It cost an awful lot of money to do that, but. I don't know. I think anything that celebrates a kind of working class history and spatiality is really interesting, So I mean, I think it's worthwhile. I mean, obviously you can go down the mine at Big Pit in Wales. I can't remember if you can do it at the English Mining Museum, but they are. If you've been down a pit, and I've only done it once, it is an incredible, humbling experience, incredibly scary, especially when the tour guide always said, I'm going to turn off the lights now, and then you can't see anything at all, because there's obviously there's no light whatsoever. So I think mining tourism, it's big in Germany, and I think that they have, because they've kind of addressed it, I think there's more of an understanding about the contribution mining made in Germany than there is here, I think.
But in the 20s, 30s, or even the Festival of Britain, do you think it would be a celebration of working class identity, or really a sense of nation, state, power, energy, that kind of...
I think both. Probably the latter more than the former, but also it was to do with getting people to work in mines, because there were always a shortage of labour, generally speaking. You know what it's like. There's either a shortage or they're laying people off. There's always one thing or another. But there was usually a kind of drive to get people in, and the right people in to do mining. So it's probably a bit of that as well.
There's one very short question from Anonymous, who asks if you have any thoughts about animal actors in the coalscape.
Animal actors? Pit ponies. Yeah. Well done. 10 points.
Or others, yeah, exactly, canaries, and I guess critters.
Well, it's I mean, I haven't talked about it, but it's They had a huge part to play, didn't they? You know, and they were there for a long time. So they're still pit ponies, I think, in the 1970s. You know, maybe even later than that. You know, yeah, in the 80s. Right. Okay. So, well, you know, so and certainly if you go to Big Pit in Wales, you can see the stalls for horses down there. You know, which is really kind of moving actually when you see. But yeah, I haven't. It's not my area of expertise. Put it that way.
Hi. A couple of comments, quick comments, then a question. One is that my husband brought up in a coal mining town when he was in the sixth form doing his A-levels. They were all taken down the local mine to show them where they would be working when they finished school. You know, so your level of education. And the other thing might be totally urban myth, but when the coal board was introducing indoor bathrooms, the story is that, you know, maybe the miners did have their wonderful showers, but they stored their coal in the bath at home. Well, whether there's any truth in that, I have no idea. But that's the story. But going back to more sort of the architectural building side, I mean, you've talked so much about structures, but do you think a lot was lost and that there was a general, you know, being scared of sort of coal mines enhanced after Aberfan? I mean, certainly in South Wales, I mean, there's not a slag heap to be seen. It's all green. It's not the country where I was brought up as well. I mean, do you think that has had an effect on what you're looking at? And why other countries may have, you know, kept more?
Well, obviously Aberfan was absolutely huge. It was a terrible moment for everything, and it changed the complete landscape of so many things. Funnily enough, the Miners' Welfare Commission, I said before that they didn't just do pithead baths, they did lots of stuff. So part of it was about kind of educating people who could leave the industry and go somewhere else. They were very candid about this, that mining might not be the best thing for people. And the other thing they did was they ameliorated landscapes. So from the very beginning, they did certain things to hide the scars of mining. And some of the things they did was actually the kind of removal of slag heaps as well. So from the very beginning, so that process was ongoing. Even before Aberfan happened, you know, there's lots of slag heaps in Scotland, you know, obviously, you know, but not ones close to towns, you know, or overshadowing towns. But there's lots of them, you know, and actually, I mean, obviously, notwithstanding the absolute tragedy of Aberfan, I think they're useful to have because they're a testimony to labour, you know, that made this landscape. I think it's a kind of, I think upon them as a kind of a positive addition to the landscape. Obviously, you know, Aberfan doesn't fall in that category whatsoever. But but I know that like there was a model coalfield made by actually John Henry Forshaw. I think had a lot of involvement in a place called Comrie, and I went to visit it. I went to take some photographs, and when I got there, they were taking down. They were massive diggers. They were pulling away the slag heap, and I thought that was a shame because there's an amazing. You can look it up on YouTube. Actually, there's an amazing film about Comrie Colliery that has those, you know, slag heaps or bings as they're called in Scotland in view, and you know how they were formed and how they were made, etc., and how Comrie had become this very, very progressive pit during the late 1930s.
Last question.
Thanks. Yeah. So I have worked in coal mine long time ago, but thank you for your talk. Very interesting. And it seems to me that one of the big differences really with any sort of mining is that what you're dealing with is a wasting asset. And it's interesting you're talking about the buildings, the architecture of the pithead baths and other buildings. So my question is, to what extent do you think the architecture of, really you're talking about the 50s, I think, 50s and 60s, to what extent do you think those architects were thinking about this is a limited life building? Because it's a truism to say they were. Yeah, I think I'm just interested in what you've got to say about that.
Yeah, I think they were, to a degree. But if you think most buildings have a lifespan nowadays of 25 years, that's what they're supposed to have. New builds are supposed to be 25 years kind of thing. It wasn't. They're probably thinking about that, actually, or maybe longer. I mean, I know that some pithead baths were built kind of, they had a system, they had a hierarchy of need when they were building pithead baths, for example, based on the need of the number of miners who would use it, but also based on the kind of the estimations of when the pit would be worked out, you know, when it'd be finished, the extraction would be finished. So they did think about that. But if you think, it's really interesting. Obviously there's a plan for coal in 1950, but there's another plan for coal in 1972. Yeah, and it's predicting the next kind of 50 years kind of thing. You know, it's kind of talking about now kind of ish. It's talking about, it's actually talking about the next 15 years, but there's a focus on, look, we've got the coal for, for these other, for decades to come, So there was a kind of, the disinvestment in mining happened pretty quickly at the end, but prior to that, it was, until quite late on, it was seen as the future.
No, the 70s was my
time,
and I remember the plan for coal in the 70s.
Yeah.
Because of course it followed the oil crisis.
Yes, of course. Yeah, there was.
And that's
Yeah.
what triggered it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It was going to be, we were going to churn out 3 times as much coal.
But I think it's really interesting because the idea that you'd make an economic plan is now kind of anathema to how we operate as modern economies. We don't do that. We don't think about, that's kind of like Soviet or something, isn't it? We can't think about the future and plan it. We just have to let it happen through the market and respond. So the idea that you'd say, right, yeah, in 50 years' time we're going to be using this much coal and using that and stuff like that. It's kind of a really interesting kind of concept, actually.
Thank you so much for great questions, great answers, and we'll have time to continue the conversation just here over a glass of something. And thanks to everyone joining online. See you soon.
Thanks very much. Great.